After World War I, Germany became a democracy. The Weimar Republic, it was named after the town of Weimar where the government was created, struggled throughout the 1920s to establish a functional democracy. However, Germany was beset by a lot of economic troubles in the 1920s, including runaway inflation, angry over the Treaty of Versailles, and internal disunity also plagued the young government. The Weimar Republic's ship of state was slowly sinking. And there in the picture at the top left, you can see their money was worth almost nothing. There's a kid playing, building towers with it because it's worth virtually nothing. Now, in the early 30s, the worldwide Great Depression hit the Weimar Republic hard, worsening the problems that already existed. Increasingly, anti-democratic parties on the right, especially the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party, threatened the Republic. Regardless of the party's name, Nazis were not socialists. It's important to understand that. They bitterly opposed socialism, communism, or any other ism for that matter, that promoted class interests or workers' rights above German ethnic solidarity. Adolf Hitler led the Nazi Party. The son of a minor Austrian civil servant, Hitler was a failed artist, a wounded and decorated World War I soldier, and a person who teetered on the brink of madness. Hitler joined the small Nazi party after the war and soon gained control of it. While in prison after the party attempted a rebellion, Hitler dictated the book Mein Kampf, which means My Struggle, in which he stated his explanations for the problems facing Germany. He criticized a lot of people in the book, political programs, ideologies, but his sharpest assaults were against communists and Jews. Hitler was violently anti-Semitic, and remember that means prejudice against Jewish people. Now, anti-Semitism had troubled Europe for centuries, mainly motivated by religious intolerance and economic resentment. In the late 19th century, new pseudo-scientific theories about Jews as a race, along with the rise of nationalism, caused Jews to be marginalized as ethnic outsiders. Hitler believed and spread this type of thinking. He preached that the greatest threat confronting Germany was the Jewish people who lived there. In Mein Kampf, which quickly became a national bestseller, Hitler presented a blueprint of his hatred and plans for world domination. The shattered German economy, the widespread unemployment, homelessness, the hunger, it played into the Nazis' hands. Recognizing the power of Hitler's party, in January 1933, the president of the Weimar Republic appointed Hitler Chancellor of Germany. And over the next 2 years, Hitler became president as well as chancellor, consolidated his power, and ruled unchecked by the Reichstag or the German parliament. By 1935, the democratic institutions of the Weimar Republic were silenced, and Hitler spoke alone as the voice of Germany. Like Stalin and Mussolini, Hitler was the symbol of his totalitarian regime, aided by a secret police that crushed all opposition, a state-controlled press that praised his accomplishments, and a state-controlled educational system. Let me go back here. The education system that essentially indoctrinated the young. Hitler assumed a godlike persona. One German described the emotions of seeing Hitler address a crowd, and here you can see what he said. There stood Hitler in a simple black coat and looked over the crowd. How many look up to him with a touching faith as their helper, their savior, their deliverer from unbearable distress, to him who rescues the scholar, the clergyman, the farmer, the worker, the unemployed, who leads them from the jumbled political parties back into the nation. By the late 1930s, Hitler's economic policies, including rearmament and massive public works projects, had ended the Depression in Germany. Get that, by the late 1930s, their depression was over. Many Germans followed his lead and cheered for him at Nazi rallies, and meanwhile, his political initiatives restricted freedom. He openly attacked Jewish people, communists, and socialists. Well, in Japan, as in Germany, The 20s was a period of increased democracy and peaceful change. The Japanese government reduced the power of the military, passed laws to give all men the right to vote, legalized trade unions, and allowed several diverse political parties to be established. This all ended when the Great Depression discredited Japan's civilian leaders in the 1930s. Now, reasserting their traditional powers, military leaders urged that expansion. They argued that expansion throughout Asia would solve Japan's economic troubles and guarantee future security. Throughout the 1930s, all through the 1930s, the military played a significant role in shaping Japanese civilian and military policy. Japan, however, this is important to note, did not become a totalitarian dictatorship. No charismatic leader like Stalin or Hitler emerged, but instead, Japan continued as a constitutional monarchy, headed by a mainly aloof emperor, right, which you can see there on the right. As the power shifted toward military control, Japan started on a course of aggressive military expansion. In 1931, Japan attacked Manchuria, which you can see there on the map, a region in northeastern China, and established a puppet state. The new nation was named Manchukuo. Japan controlled its domestic and foreign policies, as well as abundant natural resources. In 1937, Japan moved against China, gaining control over major Chinese railroad links and coastal areas. In the then capital city of Nanjing, Japanese soldiers acted with such brutality, murdering more than 200,000 residents and burning a large section of the city in an incident that came to be known as the Rape of Nanjing. In the 1930s, Italy and Germany resorted to acts of aggression similar to those of Japan and Asia. Throughout the decade, neither the League of Nations nor democratic nations succeeded in stopping all this aggression. It was a time that recalled a line from an Irish poet named William Butler Yeats. The best lack all conviction, and the worst are full of passionate intensity. Actually, let me go back here, and let's talk a little bit more about the League of Nations. Now, in many ways, the League of Nations never recovered from America's refusal to join it. And if you didn't have me in my earlier history section, understand that the League of Nations was created like a United Nations, and it was Woodrow Wilson, our president's idea, but America never joined. They wanted nothing to do with Europe. The League was also handicapped by its own character. It had no standing army, no real power to enforce its decrees. It was only as strong as its members' resolve, and during the worldwide depression of the 1930s, those members lacked resolve. When aggressive nations began to test the League, they discovered that the organization was long on words, but short on action. Now, from the first, Hitler focused on restoring Germany's strength and nullifying the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles. From 1933 to 1936, he rebuilt the German economy and dramatically enlarged the army, navy, and air force in direct defiance of the Treaty of Versailles. In the mid-1930s, Hitler began to move toward his goal of reunifying all Germanic people into one Reich, or state. He spoke often of the need for Germany to expand to gain Lebensraum, or a living space for its people. In 1935, he reclaimed the Saar region from the French control. In 1936, in a direct challenge to the League, he sent German troops into the Rhineland. The League failed to respond. Meanwhile, Mussolini commenced his own imperial plans. In 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia, an independent country in East Africa. Its emperor, Haile Selassie, appealed to the League of Nations for support. But the organization did pretty much nothing, and Ethiopia fell to Italy. Now, fascists were also victorious in the Spanish Civil War, which was a bloody conflict that raged from 1936 into 1939. The nationalists, who had fascist tendencies, rebelled against Spain's democratic Republican government. Both Hitler and Mussolini sent military and economic aid to the nationalist leader, General Francisco Franco, using the conflict to test some of their new military technology. Though the Soviet Union provided some support for the Republican side, France, Britain, and the U.S. remained largely on the sidelines, deploring the bloodshed but refusing to provide weapons to the Republican forces. Now, that policy that France and Britain pursued against aggressive nations during the 1930s is known as appeasement. Appeasement. And what that means is a policy of granting concessions to a potential enemy in the hope that it will maintain peace. Unfortunately, appeasement only spurred the fascist leaders to become more bold, adventurous, and aggressive. Why did France and Britain appease the fascist powers? There were a number of reasons. World War I was so horrible that some leaders vowed never to allow another such war to break out. Other leaders believed the Soviet Union posed a greater threat than Nazi Germany. They maintained that a strong Germany would provide a buffer against the Soviet menace. Still, other leaders questioned the resolve of their own people and their allies, particularly the United States. The U.S. played an important role in the appeasement policy. Although in the 30s, President Roosevelt pursued what he called a good neighbor policy with Latin America and improved relations with the Soviet Union, he did not take a forceful line against German aggression. Instead, the country concerned itself with its own economic troubles and embraced a policy of isolationism. Think the term isolating yourself, isolationism. Hitler took advantage of the lack of commitment and unity among France, Britain, and the U.S. In the spring of 1938, he brought Austria into his Reich. Austria was given little choice but to accept this union, called the Anschluss. In the fall, Hitler turned toward the Sudetenland, a portion of western Czechoslovakia that was largely populated by ethnic Germans. Many people expected the conflict over the Sudetenland to lead to a general war, but once again, Britain and France appeased Germany. At the Munich conference with Hitler, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, you can see him over there on the left shaking hands with Hitler, and French Premier Edouard Daladier sacrificed the Sudetenland to preserve the peace. In his return to London, Chamberlain told a cheering crowd that the Munich Pact, that agreement reached at the conference, had preserved, quote, peace for our time, end quote. He was wrong. It merely postponed the war for 11 months.